The sirens wailed as Karen stormed across my lawn, her face twisted with rage, pointing at the empty concrete crater where my pool used to be. "You destroyed my property values," she screamed at the approaching officers. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that beneath those drained waters lay a secret that would flip everything upside down. Because sometimes, when you think you're getting revenge, you're actually walking straight into justice's trap. Marcus Rivera had been planning this moment for 3 months. Not the confrontation he'd been dreading, that, but the pool renovation. Standing in his backyard at 6 a.m. on a crisp October morning, he watched the industrial pump contractor connect the massive hoses to his kidney-shaped pool. The machine hummed to life, and 20,000 gallons of chlorinated water began its journey toward the storm drain system. "It should take about 4 hours, called out Pete, the contractor, adjusting his hard hat. "You sure you want to do this right before winter?" Marcus nodded, though his stomach churned with more than morning coffee. The liners shot better, too. Get it done now, then deal with a mess come spring. What Marcus didn't mention was the real reason for the timing. His neighbor, Karen Whitmore, had made his life hell for the past year and a half. Every pool party, every family gathering, every moment of joy in his own backyard had been met with noise complaints, threatening letters, and her shrill voice, carrying over the fence about property values and neighborhood standards. The irony was thick. Karen's own yard looked like a suburban wasteland, overgrown grass, a rusted swing set, and 3 broken-down cars parked on blocks. But somehow, Marcus's well-maintained pool was the neighborhood eyesore. As the water level dropped steadily, Marcus busied himself with yard work, stealing glances at the Whitmore house. Karen's bedroom window faced his backyard, and he could see the curtains twitching. She was watching, as always. By 9 o'clock, the pool was half empty, and Karen made her appearance. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Her voice cut. Through the morning air like a rusty blade, she stood at the fence line, still in her bathrobe, her graying hair wild with sleep and indignation. Marcus straightened from where he'd been raking leaves. "Good morning to you too, Karen. Just doing some pool maintenance." "Maintenance?" She gestured wildly at the draining pool. "You're destroying it? Do you have any idea what this is going to do to my property value? Your property value?" Marcus kept his voice level, though his jaw tightened. "Karen, this is my pool on my property. I can renovate it whenever I want, not without permits, not without environmental impact studies." Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "That water is going straight into the storm drains. You're poisoning the watershed." Pete looked up from his equipment, shaking his head. In 30 years of pool work, he'd seen every type of neighbor dispute, but Karen Whitmore was in a league of her own. "Ma'am," Pete called out, "we have all the proper permits. Pool water is safe for storm drain disposal as long as chlorine levels are within EPA guidelines, which they are." Karen whirled on him. "Don't you ma'am me, I know my rights. I'm calling the city, the EPA, and the police." "Go ahead," Marcus said quietly. "You do that." But Karen was already storming back toward her house, her bathrobe billowing behind her like a cape of fury. Marcus tried to focus on his yard work, but his hands were shaking slightly. He'd known Karen would react badly, but the venom in her voice still caught him off guard. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about a year and a half of accumulated rage on both sides. The water continued to drain, and with each passing hour, Marcus felt a growing sense of unease. Not about the renovation that was legitimate, but about what Karen might do next. She'd already called the police twice in the past month over noise complaints that even the officers admitted were frivolous. She'd filed complaints with the homeowners association, the city code enforcement, and had even tried to get his pool classified as a nuisance structure. Officer Rebecca Chen stepped out of the patrol car, her expression professional but weary. She'd been to this address before multiple times, and she knew the players in this particular neighborhood drama. "Mr. Rivera," she said with a nod. Mrs. Whitmore called about environmental violations. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans. "Officer Chen, good to see you again. As you can see, we're just draining the pool for renovation. Pete here has all the permits." Pete handed over a folder thick with documentation. Officer Chen reviewed it briefly, then walked over to examine the pump setup. Everything was clearly professional and above board. "Looks like you've got everything in order," she said, handing the folder back. Mrs. Whitmore also mentioned something about property damage. Property damage? Marcus felt heat rising in his chest. What property damage? Before Officer Chen could respond, Karen appeared at her back door, now fully dressed in a navy pantsuit that made her look like she was heading to court, which, Marcus realized with a sinking feeling, she probably was. "Officer," Karen called, out, marching across both yards, without regard for property lines. "Finally, I want this man arrested for environmental terrorism and destruction of property values." Officer Chen sighed almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've discussed this. Before, property values aren't protected by criminal law, and pool maintenance isn't environmental terrorism. But look what he's doing." Karen gestured dramatically at the nearly empty pool. "He's draining thousands of gallons of chemically treated water directly into our storm system. It's going to kill fish, contaminate groundwater, and destroy the entire ecosystem," Pete interjected, producing another set of documents. "We do this kind of work every day." Karen's face reddened. "I don't care about your fake documents. I know what I see, and what I see is a deliberate attempt to damage my property values out of spite." Spite. Marcus couldn't keep quiet anymore. "Karen, you've filed 14 complaints against me in the past 18 months. 14. For having friends over, for my kids playing in the pool, for existing in my own backyard. And now you're upset because I'm renovating my own pool? Those complaints were legitimate. Not one of them was upheld. Not one." Officer Chen stepped between them. "Okay, let's all take a breath here, Mr. Rivera. You have the right to maintain your property as you see fit within city guidelines. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your concerns, but these gentlemen have all the proper permits and documentation." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Fine, but I'm not done with this. I'm calling the mayor's office, the city council, and the county environmental board. This isn't over." As she stalked back toward her house, Officer Chen turned to Marcus. "Any particular reason she's so focused on your pool?" Marcus hesitated. There was more to the story there always was with Karen, but some of it felt too petty to share with a police officer. The way she'd tried to prevent his kids from having pool parties, the anonymous complaints to the HOA about excessive noise during their daughter's birthday party, the passive-aggressive comments about certain people not belonging in the neighborhood. Officer Chen nodded, making notes in her report. "Well, you're within your rights here, but I'd recommend documenting everything, just in case this escalates further." After the officer left, Marcus stood in his backyard, staring at the nearly empty pool. What had started as a simple renovation project now felt like a declaration of war, and knowing Karen, the war was just beginning. By 3 p.m., the pool was completely drained, revealing the cracked liner that had necessitated the renovation in the first place. Pete and his crew began the process of removing the old liner, and Marcus tried to lose himself in the mundane details of the project, but his peace was short-lived. At 4:30, a white van pulled up in front of Karen's house. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as two people in suits got out, clipboard in hand, and walked toward Karen's front door. 20 minutes later, they were at his door. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Janet Mills from the County Environmental Compliance Office. We received a complaint about improper chemical disposal." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I have all the permits." "Oh, this isn't about permits," Janet said, consulting her clipboard. "This is about groundwater contamination. We need to take soil samples from your property to test for chemical runoff." "Chemical runoff? From what?" Janet looked uncomfortable. "The complaint alleges that you've been dumping pool chemicals directly into the ground for months, and that today's pool drainage was just the final step in a pattern of environmental violations." Marcus stared at her. "That's completely false. I've never dumped anything anywhere. All my pool maintenance has been by the book." "I'm sure it has," Janet said diplomatically, "but we have to investigate all complaints. The soil sampling will take about an hour, and we'll have results in 3 to 5 business days." As Janet and her colleague began taking soil samples from around the pool area, Marcus saw Karen watching from her window. Arms crossed, wearing what could only be described as a smug smile, she'd escalated things beyond a simple neighbor dispute. She was now accusing him of environmental crime. 3 days after the soil sampling, Marcus was installing new outdoor lighting when he noticed the black sedan parked across the street. It had been there for 2 hours, and the man inside seemed more interested in his house than in whatever he was supposedly reading on his phone. The environmental compliance results weren't due back for another day. But Marcus had a sinking feeling that Karen's crusade was expanding beyond county offices. He'd caught her taking pictures of his property from different angles, and twice he'd seen her talking to other neighbors, gesturing animatedly toward his house. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 18 months, Karen had been the neighborhood watchdog, cataloging every perceived violation of suburban order. Now she was about to discover just how much attention that kind of scrutiny could bring. Marcus's phone buzzed. Janet Mills from Environmental Compliance. Mr. Rivera. To talk? Can you meet us at your property in 30 minutes? Is there a problem with the soil samples? Just please be available. We're bringing some colleagues. When Marcus hung up, his hands were trembling slightly. He'd been dreading this call, but not for the reasons Karen would expect. The convoy arrived exactly 30 minutes later to county environmental vehicles, a state inspector's car, and to Marcus's growing alarm, unmarked federal sedan. 6 officials in total, armed with clipboards, testing equipment, and expressions ranging from professional curiosity to barely contained excitement. Janet Mills approached first, flanked by a woman Marcus didn't recognize and a man in a federal jacket that read EPA, Criminal Investigation Division. Mr. Rivera, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the State Environmental Lab, and Agent Rodriguez from the EPA. We need to discuss the soil analysis results. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. EPA, Criminal Investigation. The soil samples revealed some ... unexpected findings, Dr. Chen said, consulting a thick folder. The good news is that there's no evidence of pool chemical contamination. Your drainage was completely within legal guidelines. Marcus exhaled, but Agent Rodriguez stepped forward. However, the samples revealed the presence of industrial solvents and heavy metals consistent with illegal chemical disposal. The concentrations suggest this has been going on for some time. That's impossible, Marcus said immediately. I've never disposed of any industrial chemicals. I work in software development. I don't even have access to that kind of material. Dr. Chun nodded. We believe you. The chemical signatures and soil stratification indicate the contamination predates your residence here by several years, possibly decades. Agent Rodriguez was studying the property layout. Mr. Rivera, how long have you lived here? 4 years. We bought the house from the previous owners, the Hendersons. They'd lived here since the 1980s, and before the Hendersons. Marcus searched his memory. The realtor mentioned it was some kind of industrial property before the neighborhood was developed, maybe a small manufacturing plant. The officials exchanged glances. Agent Rodriguez made a note. Mr. Rivera, we're going to need to expand our investigation. This appears to be a legacy contamination site, possibly from illegal dumping or improper storage of hazardous materials. We'll need to test the entire property and potentially neighboring lots. As if summoned by the mention of neighboring lots, Karen appeared at the fence line. She'd clearly been watching the proceedings, and her expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to growing concern. What's going on over there? She called out. Are you finally arresting him? Agent Rodriguez looked up from his notes. Ma'am, are you the neighbor who filed the complaint? Karen straightened, sensing an opportunity. I am Karen Whitmore, concerned citizen and property owner. I've been documenting this man's environmental violations for months. Could you join us, please? We have some questions. Karen practically floated across the yard, radiating vindication. But as she got closer, Marcus noticed Agent Rodriguez studying her with a kind of professional attention that usually meant trouble. Mrs. Whitmore, you've been observing Mr. Rivera's property maintenance activities? Constantly. I keep detailed records of every violation, every suspicious activity, every how long have you lived in your current residence? Karen paused, seeming to sense that the conversation was shifting in an unexpected direction. 15 years. Why, Dr. Chen consulted her folder. Mrs. Whitmore, our preliminary tests suggest the contamination extends beyond Mr. Rivera's property. We're going to need to test your soil as well. The color drained from Karen's face. My soil. Why would you need to test my soil? Because underground contamination doesn't respect property lines, Agent Rodriguez explained. If there's been illegal dumping in this area, it could affect multiple lots. We'll need access to your backyard for sampling. Absolutely not. Karen's voice cracked like a whip. You don't have permission to go on my property. This is about him, not me. Agent Rodriguez and Dr. Chen exchanged another look. In their line of work, aggressive refusal to cooperate was always interesting. Mrs. Whitmore, this is a federal environmental investigation, Agent Rodriguez said calmly. We can obtain a warrant if necessary, but cooperation would be much simpler. I know my rights. You can't just dig up my yard because of some bogus test results. The test results aren't bogus, Dr. Chen said. We're dealing with serious contamination that poses potential health risks to the entire neighborhood. This isn't about property disputes anymore. Karen's face was cycling through various shades of red and white. There's nothing wrong with my property. I've lived there for 15 years with no problems. Mrs. Whitmore, Janet Mills, interjected, have you ever noticed any unusual odors in your yard? Discolored soil? Problems with plants growing? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus watched Karen's expression change, saw the exact moment when defiance shifted to something that looked suspiciously like fear. I know. Nothing unusual, but her voice had lost its commanding edge, and Agent Rodriguez was taking notes again. We'll start with Mr. Rivera's property and work outward, he said. Mrs. Whitmore will contact you within 24 hours about scheduling your soil sampling. As the officials began setting up their equipment, Karen remained frozen by the fence, watching her perfect plan dissolve into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple neighbor complaint. Marcus, meanwhile, was experiencing a different kind of revelation. For months, he'd assumed Karen's hostility was personal racism, classism, or just general nastiness. But her reaction to the soil testing suggested something else entirely. She knew something about the contamination, something she desperately didn't want the authorities to discover. The testing continued through the afternoon, with investigators taking samples from multiple locations around Marcus's property. Each new test seemed to reveal higher concentrations of industrial chemicals, and Agent Rodriguez's expression grew more serious with each result. Mr. Rivera, he said during a break in the testing, I need to ask you some questions about your property purchase. Did the previous owners disclose any environmental issues? None. The inspection came back clean. What about during construction of your pool 4 years ago? Did the contractors mention finding anything unusual in the soil? Marcus thought back to the pool installation. Actually, yes. They said the soil composition was weird in some areas, more clay-like, with some discoloration. But they said it was probably just natural variation. Agent Rodriguez made more notes. Did they have to excavate deeply? About 8 feet at the deep end. They did mention hitting some kind of old concrete or foundation material, but they just worked around it. Foundation material. The crew chief said it looked like the remains of an old building foundation, maybe from whatever was here before the neighborhood was developed. Dr. Chen looked up from her testing equipment. Agent Rodriguez, we're getting significant readings in the area near the pool excavation. I think we need to bring in ground-penetrating radar. As the day wore on, the investigation expanded. More vehicles arrived, more officials joined the team, and the testing equipment grew more sophisticated. What had started as a simple neighbor complaint was becoming a major environmental investigation. Karen had retreated to her house, but Marcus could see her pacing past her windows, occasionally peering out at the growing activity in his yard. By evening, Agent Rodriguez approached Marcus with a grim expression. Mr. Rivera, we're going to need to expand this investigation significantly. The contamination levels we're finding suggest this could be a major illegal dumping site. We're talking about potentially thousands of gallons of industrial solvents and heavy metals buried on your property. But you said it predates my ownership. It does, by decades. But we need to determine the full extent of the contamination and identify who was responsible. This is now a federal criminal investigation. Marcus felt the weight of those words. A federal criminal investigation. In his backyard, because Karen Whitmore had been so determined to destroy him that she'd invited the full power of the federal government to examine his property with a microscope. What happens now? Tomorrow we bring in excavation equipment and ground-penetrating radar. We're going to map the entire contamination site, and Mrs. Whitmore's property is definitely going to be tested, whether she cooperates or no. The excavation equipment arrived at dawn, along with a convoy that looked more like a military operation than a suburban investigation. 3 EPA vehicles, 2 state environmental trucks, a ground-penetrating radar unit, and a backhoe that could dig down 20 feet. Marcus stood in his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching federal agents transform his backyard into a crime scene. Because that's what it was. No agent Rodriguez had been clear about that. This wasn't environmental cleanup anymore. This was a criminal investigation into decades-old illegal dumping. The irony was suffocating. Karen's vindictive neighbor complaint had uncovered what appeared to be a major federal crime, and from the way she'd been pacing her house all night, Marcus had seen her silhouette in the windows until 3 a.m. She knew it. Mr. Rivera. Agent Rodriguez knocked on his back door. "We're ready to begin the excavation." Marcus nodded. His wife Alina and the kids had already gone to her mother's house. They'd planned it as a precaution, but now it felt like an evacuation. "Any idea what you're going to find down there?" Agent Rodriguez's expression was grim. "Based on the radar scans, there are multiple buried containers. Industrial drums, possibly in what looks like concrete structures that don't match any building permits on file." As Marcus gathered his things to leave, he noticed Karen standing at her bedroom window, still in her bathrobe, watching the excavation setup with an expression that had moved beyond fear into something approaching terror. Their eyes met across the yards, and for the first time in 18 months of conflict, Karen looked away first. Marcus drove to his office, but concentration was impossible. Every hour, he called Agent Rodriguez for updates, and each call brought more disturbing news. "We've found the first drum," Rodriguez reported at 10 a.m. "Industrial solvent, probably from the 1970s, based on the labeling, completely corroded through. There are at least 6 more at noon. We've uncovered what looks like a concrete disposal pit. Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide this stuff. At 2 p.m., Mr. Rivera, we need you back here. We've found something that complicates the investigation." Marcus raced home to find his backyard looking like an archaeological dig. The area where his pool had been was now a crater 15 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Industrial drums were stacked along the perimeter, their contents being cataloged by technicians in hazmat suits. But Agent Rodriguez wasn't looking at the drums. He was standing next to a section of excavated concrete that had been pressure-washed clean, painted numbers and letters. "Mr. Rivera, does the name Whitmore Chemical Processing mean anything to you?" Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place like a puzzle solving itself. "Whitmore, as in your neighbor, yes. This concrete slab has the company name and what appears to be a permit number from 1974. We've contacted the state archives. Whitmore Chemical Processing was a small industrial outfit that operated on this site from 1968 to 1979. Marcus stared at the concrete slab, then across the fence at Karen's house. She was nowhere to be seen now, but her car was still in the driveway. So Karen's family owned the company that was illegally dumping chemicals here. That's what we're trying to determine. The company was shut down in 1979 for environmental violations, but apparently not before they buried a significant amount of hazardous waste. The question is whether Mrs. Whitmore knew about this when she moved into the neighborhood. Agent Rodriguez paused, consulting his notes. "Actually, that's not the only question. We've been doing some research on property records. Mrs. Whitmore didn't just move into the neighborhood 15 years ago. She bought her house specifically because of its proximity to this site." "What do you mean?" "She purchased her property from a shell company that was connected to Whitmore Chemical Processing. The sale happened just 2 years after your house was built, right around the time environmental regulations were getting stricter and old industrial sites were being scrutinized." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. "She's been watching this site, making sure no one dug too deep." "That's our working theory. And your pool installation 4 years ago, then this renovation, ... double quotes, Agent Rodriguez gestured at the excavation. "She probably realized it was only a matter of time before someone found the buried waste, so she tried to get rid of me." 18 months of harassment and complaints, all designed to make you want to move away. But when that didn't work and you started major excavation work, she panicked and called in authorities, thinking she could frame me for the contamination. Agent Rodriguez nodded grimly. Instead, she handed us the biggest environmental crime scene we've investigated in 5 years. As if summoned by their conversation, a new vehicle pulled up to the curb. Not another government car, but a local police cruiser. Officer Chen got out, along with a detective Marcus didn't recognize. Agent Rodriguez, Officer Chen called out, "We have a problem. Mrs. Whitmore is gone." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Gone. Neighbors saw her loading suitcases into her car around dawn, right when your excavation started. She's not answering her phone, and the house appears to be empty. Detective Morrison, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, approached the group. "We've run her plates. Karen Whitmore's car was spotted on I-95 South about 2 hours ago. She's running." Agent Rodriguez was already pulling out his phone. "I'll alert the field offices." "How far south?" "Last sighting was near the state line. If she's heading for Florida, she's got a significant head start." Marcus looked around at the chaos in his backyard, the excavation, the hazmat suits, the rows of corroded chemical drums, and realized that Karen's flight was an admission of guilt that tied everything together. "Agent Rodriguez," he said slowly, "if Karen knew about this contamination for 15 years, and she's been living right next to it, she's been exposed to the same chemicals. Yes, long-term exposure to the solvents we're finding here can cause neurological damage, personality changes, increased aggression, Double quotes, the detective looked up from his notes. "Are you saying the contamination might have been affecting her behavior?" "It's possible. The chemicals we're finding include substances that can cause paranoia, aggressive behavior, and impaired judgment with prolonged exposure." Marcus thought about 18 months of increasingly erratic behavior from Karen. The obsessive documentation, the middle-of-the-night complaint, calls the escalating hostility that seemed to go beyond normal neighbor disputes. But she ran, Detective Morrison pointed out. If she was just a victim of chemical exposure, why run? Agent Rodriguez was studying the excavation site. Because she wasn't just a victim, she was a co-conspirator. "What do you mean? Think about it. A small chemical processing company illegally buries thousands of gallons of industrial waste. The site gets developed into a residential neighborhood, and 15 years later, a member of the original company's family moves in right next door to monitor the burial site." Marcus felt the full scope of Karen's deception settling over him. She's been the lookout, making sure no one disturbed the site, and getting paid for it, most likely. "We'll need to examine her financial records, but I'm betting we'll find payments from someone connected to the original company." Detective Morrison was already on his radio, coordinating with other jurisdictions. "I'll put out a bolo alert. If she's running, she knows we're close to something big." As the afternoon wore on, the excavation revealed the full scope of the illegal dumping. Dozens of industrial drums, concrete-lined disposal pits, and buried chemical storage tanks that had been leaking into the groundwater for decades. But it was the discovery of company records, buried in waterproof containers, that provided the final piece of the puzzle. "Mr. Rivera," Agent Rodriguez called out, holding up a plastic-wrapped folder. "You need to see this." The documents were purchase orders, disposal manifests, and financial records from Whitmore Chemical Processing. But the signatures on the disposal contracts weren't from the 1970s. They were dated from the 1990s and 2000s. "Someone's been using this site for ongoing illegal disposal for decades," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Small amounts, probably from other industrial operations, and based on these financial records, Karen Whitmore was receiving regular payments for site maintenance and security." Marcus stared at the documents. She's been running an illegal disposal operation out of her backyard for 15 years. And you, building a pool, then renovating it, threatened to expose the whole thing. So she tried to destroy you first. The scope of Karen's betrayal was staggering. For 18 months, she'd positioned herself as the defender of neighborhood standards while literally poisoning the ground beneath their feet. She'd harassed his family, filed false complaints, and tried to drive them away from their home, all to protect a criminal operation that had been contaminating their water and soil for decades. But her own vindictive nature had been her downfall. In her desperation to frame Marcus for environmental crimes, she'd invited federal investigators to examine the very site she'd been hired to protect. Detective Morrison approached with an update. "We've got confirmation. Karen Whitmore's car was spotted at a gas station." Karen Whitmore's flight lasted exactly 36 hours. The The call came at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, jolting Marcus awake from the first decent sleep he'd had in a week. Agent Rodriguez's voice was tired but triumphant. "We got her. Port of Savannah." She was trying to board a cargo ship to Panama. Marcus sat up in bed, Alina stirring beside him. A cargo ship, fake passport, cash payment, the works. She had this planned as an escape route for years, but she panicked and ran too early before the ship was ready to sail. The capture had been almost anticlimactic. Karen, desperate and sleep-deprived after 2 days of driving, had made a crucial mistake at the port. She'd used her real credit card to buy supplies, creating a digital trail that led authorities directly to her location. What happens now? She's being extradited back here for arraignment, and Mr. Rivera, you're going to want to hear what she told us. 3 days later, Marcus sat in a federal courthouse watching Karen Whitmore shuffle into the courtroom in orange jumpsuit and shackles. The transformation was startling. The imperious neighbor who had terrorized his family for 18 months now looked like a broken woman, hollow-eyed, defeated, and significantly older than her 54 years. But it was her confession, read aloud by the prosecutor, that revealed the true scope of her crimes. Karen Whitmore hadn't just been monitoring the illegal disposal site. She'd been expanding it. For 15 years, she'd accepted payments from multiple industrial companies to dispose of their hazardous waste in the buried facility beneath Marcus's property. Small amounts, carefully managed to avoid detection, but totaling thousands of gallons of illegal chemicals that had been slowly poisoning the neighborhood's groundwater. The payments had been substantial, over $200,000 annually for environmental consulting services. Karen had used the money to maintain her middle-class lifestyle while literally living on top of a toxic waste dump. But the most damning revelation was yet to come. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "the defendant's confession reveals that she specifically targeted Mr. Rivera's family when they moved into the neighborhood 4 years ago." Marcus felt Elena's hand tighten on his arm, according to Mrs. Whitmore's statement. She was concerned that Mr. Rivera's pool installation might disturb the buried waste containers. She began a systematic campaign of harassment designed to force the family to move away from the property. When harassment failed to achieve the desired result, Mrs. Whitmore escalated to filing false complaints with multiple government agencies, attempting to create legal and financial pressure that would force the family to relocate. Judge Patricia Hawkins looked up from her notes, and when that failed, Mrs. Whitmore admits to considering more ... direct action. The confession details plans to damage Mr. Rivera's property, file false police reports alleging criminal activity, and even plant evidence to support those reports. Marcus felt sick. The woman who had spent 18 months positioning herself as the moral authority of the neighborhood had been planning to frame him for crimes to protect her own criminal enterprise. However, the prosecutor continued, before Mrs. Whitmore could implement these plans, Judge Hawkins studied Karen, who was staring at her hands. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you understand the charges against you?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor. 23 counts of illegal disposal of hazardous materials, counts of conspiracy to violate environmental protection laws, 18 counts of filing false reports, and 1 count of attempted obstruction of justice." "How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor, to all charges." The plea hearing concluded with sentencing scheduled for 6 weeks later, but the real revelations came during the victim impact phase of the investigation. Agent Rodriguez met with Marcus and Alina the following week with results from the expanded environmental testing. "The contamination is worse than we initially thought," he began, spreading maps across Marcus's kitchen table. "The buried chemicals have been leaching into the groundwater for decades. We've found elevated levels of industrial solvents in wells throughout the neighborhood." Alina paled. "Are we safe to live here?" "The immediate danger is minimal. Most of the contamination is deep underground. But long-term exposure, ... double quotes, Agent Rodriguez hesitated. "We're recommending health screenings for all residents who've lived in the area for more than 2 years." Marcus studied the contamination maps. "What about Karen? She lived right next to it for 15 years. We had her examined during intake." Agent Rodriguez produced a medical report. "Chronic exposure to the solvents we found can cause neurological damage, including increased aggression, paranoia, and impaired judgment. Mrs. Whitmore's blood work shows significant exposure levels. so the chemicals were making her crazy. Contributing to it, yes, disposal operation before the neurological effects became severe. The chemical exposure made her more erratic and aggressive, but it didn't make her a criminal. Alina shook her head in disbelief. She was poisoning the entire neighborhood to protect her illegal business, and the poison was driving her insane. It's a feedback loop we see sometimes in environmental crime cases. The perpetrator becomes a victim of their own actions, which makes them more desperate and dangerous. The environmental cleanup would take months and cost millions of dollars. The EPA was pursuing the original Whitmore chemical processing partners, most of whom were now in their 70s and 80s, for restitution. Several had died, but their estates would face massive civil judgments. But for Marcus, the most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later when he received a call from Detective Morrison. "You're going to love this," Morrison said. "We've been going through Karen's financial records, and we found something interesting. More criminal activity. More like criminal incompetence. Remember all those complaints she filed against you over the past 18 months? Marcus certainly remembered. 14 separate complaints to various agencies, all dismissed, but each requiring hours of his time and significant stress. Well, it turns out, Karen was claiming the costs of filing those complaints as business expenses on her tax returns, professional services rendered to protect the neighborhood's environmental integrity." Marcus almost laughed, despite himself. "She was writing off harassing me on her taxes. Gets better. She also claimed her surveillance equipment, the cameras she used to monitor your property as business expenses, and the legal fees for consulting with attorneys about how to force you to move. Is that illegal? Filing false tax returns to cover up environmental crimes. Oh yeah. The IRS is very interested in Mrs. Whitmore's creative accounting. The tax evasion charges would add another 5 to 7 years to Karen's sentence. Her attempt to nickel-and-dime the government had created a paper trail that documented her criminal conspiracy in excruciating detail. But the final twist came during Karen's sentencing hearing. Judge Hawkins had reviewed the pre-sentence reports, victim impact statements, and medical evaluations. Karen's attorney had argued for leniency based on her chemical exposure and deteriorating mental state. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Hawkins said, "I've read the medical reports about your chemical exposure. I understand that your judgment was impaired by the very toxins you were being paid to dispose of illegally." Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "However, the evidence shows that you began this criminal enterprise before the chemical exposure reached levels that would significantly impair your judgment. You made a conscious choice to endanger your neighbors for financial gain." The judge paused, studying Karen over her reading glasses. "What's particularly troubling is your systematic harassment of the Rivera family. You didn't just commit environmental crimes, you tried to destroy innocent people to cover up those crimes." Marcus watched Karen's shoulders shake with sobs. "Your actions contaminated not just the groundwater, but the entire fabric of your community. You turned neighborhood watch into neighborhood persecution, environmental protection into environmental destruction, and civic responsibility into criminal conspiracy." Judge Hawkins' voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Therefore, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will also pay full restitution for environmental cleanup costs, estimated at $4.2 million, and compensatory damages to affected residents." As Karen was led away in shackles, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: pity. The woman who had made his life hell for 18 months was herself a victim of the crimes she'd committed. The toxic chemicals she'd been paid to hide had poisoned her judgment as surely as they'd poisoned the groundwater. But justice had been served. The neighborhood watchdog had finally been held accountable for the very crimes she'd pretended to prevent. Walking out of the courthouse, Marcus realized that his simple pool renovation had uncovered not just buried chemicals, but buried truth. Karen's vindictive campaign against his family had backfired spectacularly, exposing decades of environmental crime and corruption. Sometimes the base